Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to wait about 15 seconds so everyone can join us from the waiting room. So I'm not going to say anything too important for the next 15 seconds, but I will let you know that my name is Robert Hayes. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian and Head of Technical Services here at the Tewksbury Public Library, and we're very grateful for you to be joining us here tonight. Just logistically, a few things. We're using Zoom webinar tonight. So Ashlyn, John, and myself cannot see you or hear you. We cannot see or hear the audience. If you have a question for Ashlyn and John, you're going to want to type it into the Q&A box. And if you have a comment for Ashlyn or John, you're going to type that into the comment box, the chat box. So Ashlyn is going to give a roughly 45-minute slideshow presentation, uninterrupted, and then we'll take questions and Q&A and comments at the very end of the presentation. And again, you're going to want to type comments into the chat and questions into the Q&A. I am recording tonight's presentation, but again, we cannot see any audience members, so don't worry about that. And I think that just about does it. For anyone who's watching live, you will be receiving an email from me tomorrow morning with a link to a feedback survey. Please take 30 seconds and fill that out. Let us know what you thought of tonight's event and what you'd like to see for future events, courtesy of the library. And I should also mention that the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library are sponsoring tonight's event. All funding for library programs comes either through grants or through the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library, who they're our fundraising arm. And I should mention, I'm going to do this impromptu here, that the Friends, starting next month, will be selling a community cookbook. This consists of roughly 100 recipes from Tewksbury residents and business owners and community leaders and town department heads and all sorts of folks, some politicians. So these are all Tewksbury folks who donated donated recipes to us for our cookbook. So this cookbook will be on sale at the Tewksbury Community Market, which is every Thursday from 4 to 7 in the field across from the library. And that's from Thursday, June 17th to Thursday, September 16th. So this will be on sale for the next 4 months over the summer. I believe that it's $10 to $15 a book, and you can definitely take advantage and get some great recipes for the summer. So we'll put those there. All right, so we're gonna get to the good stuff. Here we go, one moment. Oh, and I did want to also plug that Ashlyn and John will be at the Public Health Museum on Saturday, June 5th. So next Saturday, June 5th, from 10 to 2. They'll be selling and autographing copies of their book. So if you want to see them live and get an autographed copy, it's just a book signing, not a talk, but certainly they'll answer your questions. That's next Saturday, June 5th, from 10 to 2 at the Public Health Museum. Okay, so now let me formally get to introductions here. Hopefully everyone who's coming is here now. So tonight's program is entitled The History of the Tewksbury State Hospital. Authors Ashlyn Rickard Werner and John Maynard will discuss their brand new book, Tewksbury State Hospital, Images of America, in this Zoom webinar. So Ashlyn is an historian of state hospitals for the mentally ill and state schools for the developmentally disabled. She serves on the board of directors for the Public Health Museum here in Tewksbury, which is housed in the old administration building at Tewksbury State Hospital. John is an historian, preservationist, and architectural photographer. He runs Westboro State Hospital, Inc., which is a registered 501c3 nonprofit that is building a memorial to the now demolished hospital. So everyone on the line, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Ashlyn and John for joining us here tonight. And Ashlyn and John, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Robert, for that introduction. We are so happy to be here tonight and talk to you about the history of Tewksbury State Hospital. So I will get started here. So tonight's presentation will provide broad strokes of the history of the institution over its 167 years of operation, and will include excerpts from the book along the way. But you'll only get a glimpse. You obviously, to learn more, you'll have to pick up a copy of the book. But tonight we will take you through the history and how it went from this one building, this one wooden structure, to this. A bustling historic campus of over 700 acres with 5 state agencies, 9 clinical programs, a continuously operational hospital that provides a broad range of clinical services as well as specialized services, and several nonprofits, including the Public Health Museum, all of which inhabit the historic buildings on the grounds of Tewksbury State Hospital. Now let's look at the history. The creation of the state almshouses sprung from the recommendation of the Joint Special Committee on Alien Passengers and State Paupers in 1852, in which the legislature of the Commonwealth authorized Governor Boutwell to appoint 3 commissioners to select 3 sites for the purpose of erecting almshouses that could accommodate 500 state paupers each. The commissioners believed that the expenses incurred to construct these institutions would be recouped within 2 years from immigration tax income, and the almshouses would become self-sufficient, thus financially beneficial to the state. In selecting these 3 sites, the commissioners were tasked with choosing a location within the counties of Bristol or Plymouth for one, the counties of Essex or Middlesex for another, and to the portion of the Commonwealth west of the town of Brookfield for the third. So the selected sites are located or seen here on the map were to be in Bridgewater, Monson, and Tewksbury. While evaluating the potential locations for the new almshouses, the commissioners gave priority to sites that were in close proximity to railroad lines, had access to a healthy water source, possessed farmable land, and could be bought for a bargain. Tewksbury met each of these considerations. It fell along the Lowell and Lawrence Railroad lines, which converged with the Salem and Lowell Railroad about 4 miles east of the potential almshouse site. The Strongwater Brook passed through the proposed property, and the town of Tewksbury itself sat between the Concord and Merrimack rivers, creating a natural richness for farming, although they thought that. We'll talk later about how that wasn't necessarily the case. Albeit requiring pauper labor to best cultivate the reclaimed land in the early years. And lastly, the land was able to be purchased for a very low rate per acre. In total, roughly 142 acres were purchased in the town of Tewksbury for about $24 per acre for a sum total of $3,423.59. So with the selection of Tewksbury as its location in the north, on May 1st, 1854, Governor Emory Washburn issued a proclamation to open the state almshouse at Tewksbury. The original building in which the almshouse opened was constructed of wood. The commissioners tasked with erecting the 3 almshouses chose wood for the building's construction as it saved over $26,000 in comparison to utilizing brick. The commissioners were conscious of the hazards with wood construction, as we can imagine, but they believed the structure would suffice for 50 to 75 years. They decided to incur the additional expense of installing a slate roof and iron gutters instead of shod shingles and wooden gutters, which would hopefully boost the almshouse's safety. Also, just note here, let me put on the little laser pointer. Notice the little planted trees along the pathways here. Also the lack of shingles on the windows of the main buildings, and how there was no porch or back area just over here. You'll see the changes in the next few photos. Also, I just wanted to note that this is likely the earliest photo we have of the almshouse, because as you'll see in these later photos, you'll see some of the upgrades and changes to the buildings as well. So the almshouse building was a U-shaped structure with 4 stories at the center and 3 stories on both wings. The center housed the administrative functions of the almshouse, and the wings were separated with males on one side and females on the other. Between the wings was a lush courtyard designed to be both majestic to the public and therapeutic for the patients. Okay, so now we can notice the changes here. The trees have grown, as you can see here. There are these little bump outs on the building here that were added. And shingles have also been added to many of the windows. And this is just another one of the photos of the original almshouse building. I love to show as many as possible because there's only about 10 of them. So not many to choose from, but always amazing to see these original photos of the first almshouse. And there's one other that we'll see in a few minutes. So the early years of the almshouse operations were overseen by Isaac Hall Meserve, the first superintendent. Under his leadership, relatively all patients were employed about the almshouse, either for housework in the various shops or attending to the farm. Under Meserve's superintendency, he was known very well for vastly improving the grounds and farmland. The farm, likened to the Sahara Desert in early years, was brimming with trees, bushes, stumps, stones, and plowed sandy earth. As I mentioned, they were hoping that this would be a really rich spot. Didn't turn out to be so much. Substantial blasting and removal of stone was completed, and the materials were reused to build roads and a stone fence around the yard. The cleared land was finally able to be cultivated for the harvesting of grains and vegetables for the almshouse. As emissions continued to rise, the need for further expansion became dire. Thomas J. Marsh, who became superintendent in 1858, led the charge of increasing the institutional capacity and providing more specialized care for the inmate population. Between 1860 and 1880, many facilities were added, including infectious disease hospitals, a hospital for the insane, a reservoir, barn, and other outbuildings. Also to note, this is one of the other photos of the original almshouse building here. And this is the only one that I've ever actually been able to see the other side of the building. So that's on our view now of the campus. That's kind of the front side. And this is the only photo where I can actually see the other side of that building. So the expansion of campus, infrastructural upgrades, like the addition of water reservoirs and a pumping station, as well as upgrades to the steam heating system throughout the almshouse, and improvements to medical care offered to patients were the work of the second superintendent, Thomas J. Marsh. And this image is the only known photograph of Thomas J. Marsh, and then his wife, Nancy F. Marsh here. As you can see, this is kind of a fairly damaged image. We did not even realize we had this in the Public Health Museum collection, but there was a little note on the back saying who it was, and I got so excited. I was almost in tears because I have always wanted to see an image of Thomas Marsh. And there he is. Although it's not great, you can only slightly make him out. He is there. So Marsh got a bad rap due to allegations brought against him and the administrators of the state almshouse by Governor Benjamin Butler. And most people, that is the one main story they know about Tewksbury Almshouse and Tewksbury Hospital as the story of Marsh and Butler. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that. So Butler, a rugged and controversial political leader who served as a major general of the Union Army during the Civil War, became governor of Massachusetts in January of 1883. In his inaugural address, he issued a scathing charge against the administrators of the Tewksbury Almshouse for gross misconduct and unsanitary conditions. A full investigation was launched with the help of the State Board of Health, Lunacy, and Charity, taking control of the almshouse as Governor Butler suspended the institution's trustees from carrying out their duties as of April 28, 1883. The investigative committee spent several months in the spring and the summer of '83, visiting the almshouse, hearing testimony, and examining evidence of mismanagement. Among the allegations was the claim from Governor Butler that hundreds of deceased infants and adults were sold to medical institutions in Boston. The investigative committee found that bodies were sold for anatomical research, but it was fully within the jurisdiction of the law of the time. Butler would continue to incite wrongdoing, going as far as to claim that bodies were sent away to be tanned and used for leather work. Another assertion by Governor Butler was that after a deceased patient was buried in the almshouse cemetery, they would be dug up and sent off to medical school for a profit. He also professed that in more instances than one, funeral services were held over supposed remains, being that coffins would be filled with wood to deceive the patient's loved ones. Despite Governor Butler's persistence and the accounts presented by individuals who alleged administrative negligence, the investigative committee ultimately found the main charges of the governor against the state almshouse at Tewksbury and its administrators, quote, groundless and cruel. Instead of appearing admirable, Governor Butler was actually labeled an embarrassment, having needlessly brought shame and humiliation upon the Commonwealth. The committee, though, did, however, identify some carelessness by members of the almshouse administration and trustees, but nothing that substantiated removal from office. Instead, the committee requested better bookkeeping and review of policies, especially in regards to nepotism, as several members of the Marsh family were employed at the almshouse. Ultimately, Thomas J. Marsh, Mrs. Marsh, and Thomas J. Marsh Jr., his son, all resigned from their service to the state almshouse in 1883. The only member of the Marsh family to remain was Charles Marsh, over here on the left, who served as clerk. Chester Irving Fisher, in the middle here, would assume the role of superintendent and resident physician, and John Cocker, at the right, would become the assistant superintendent. Although Superintendent Fisher led the state almshouse for only 8 years, he had many noteworthy accomplishments. He refined the classification of patients while applying business methods consistent with hospital requirements to improve overall almshouse administration. He established a consulting board made up of revered Boston physicians to provide advice and support for the betterment of the hospital department. And he initiated an intern program in conjunction with Harvard Medical College, among other accolades. The superintendency of Dr. Fisher brought the almshouse into a new and prosperous era in its history and set the stage for its future medical success under his successor, Dr. Herbert Howard. So Herbert Howard completed his medical studies at Harvard University in 1884 and served as a physician actually at Tewksbury before being promoted to superintendent. His approach to the superintendent role was to build on many of the hospital advances that his predecessor made, Fisher, including continuing the internship program with Harvard Medical School. Howard also supported additional training opportunities for staff, especially nurses, and succeeded in infrastructural improvements for the campus. Howard would serve the state almshouse until 1897 before being appointed to the position of resident physician at Match General Hospital, not too far away from us. He would also serve on the State Board of Insanity as president of the American Hospital Association and would become the first superintendent of the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital before his retirement. It was under Howard's superintendency that we saw the greatest campus expansion, the buildings that we know today and continue to make up the historic Tewksbury State Hospital campus. It was also Howard that commissioned the demolition of the original almshouse building, as it was unsafe and outdated for a campus set on expanding its medical and clinical offerings to patients. And you know, the wood piece of the building wasn't great. So like, yeah, we should probably move to a new building. So buildings like this one, what we know now as the old administration building, were erected on the campus. The administration building would replace the original almshouse building as a central location for hospital administrators and admissions for the institution. The superintendent's home would also be added. The first superintendent to live here would obviously be Dr. Howard. And the chapel, where patients could attend religious services, plays, musical performances, and other opportunities for recreation. Howard was also keen on continuing the improvements to the medical department that his predecessor championed. The men's hospital buildings continued to expand as more patients were being admitted with conditions that required medical treatment and intervention. An initial patient examination could also yield a diagnosis that required surgical intervention for improvement and eventual discharge. The earliest surgical procedures began in 1874 and continued to advance over the next 2 decades until it became its own subset of the medical department. In 1893, around 350 surgical operations were performed on men in the institution, the most common being uroplasty. Sorry if I butchered that. The doctor up in the corner here is pictured alongside Miss Elizabeth McClawson and Miss Linda Nace, both graduates of the training school for nurses on the campus, and they're actually pictured in the operating room of the male hospital. The case holding the surgical instruments here is on display at the Public Health Museum, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a second. By 1901, hospital administrators acknowledged the shortcomings of the operating rooms within the male hospital and the female hospital as being too small and ill-equipped. So then they suggested the creation of one main surgical building, which would come shortly thereafter. So they wanted to expand from this little building to its own surgical building. So obviously, if you notice that little case on the right in the last picture, here it is today, over 100 years later at the Public Health Museum. Now, actually, what once held medical equipment now holds objects about tuberculosis, one of the infectious diseases that was often treated at Tewksbury State Hospital. And we will come back to some of the other history of the hospital as it relates to infectious disease soon, but I first want to talk briefly about the mental health history at Tewksbury. Basically, from the beginning of its time as an almshouse, Tewksbury regularly accepted patients with mental health conditions, enough so that they created a formal insane department, was the name, and constructed a massive building called the Long Asylum to serve as the home of patients within that department. The Long Asylum is just back there. There's the building again. A massive structure, the Long Asylum was built to house the harmless insane, as it was suspected that it would be more cost-effective to the state to provide for this class of patients at the almshouse instead of one of the mental hospitals in the state. The almshouse administrators also benefited from the exchange, as this category of patients proved to be useful laborers on the farm and in the various trade shops around the campus. So work for patients could include working in the laundry. There's a few photos of the laundry and patients out front. There's the interior. Another shot of the interior of the laundry. And some folks ironing there, patients ironing. Or work could involve being on the farm. There's some of the cows. Or in bookbinding, as up top, or even the weaving department. Seen as opportunity for work, administrators also viewed these jobs as a way to build a patient's skills for life after institutionalization, as well as a therapeutic measure, with work therapy as a form of restorative treatment in their minds. As a last act of his superintendency, Dr. Howard was able to witness the opening of a new asylum for women established at the southern edge of the yard. Inhabited on May 1st, 1897, and designed by John A. Fox, the new asylum was reserved for violent female cases in the insane department. Asylum 8, or the Belcher Insane Hospital, was named after the Honorable J. White Belcher, longtime chairman of the Board of Trustees at the State Almshouse. Belcher became acquainted with the almshouse in 1874 in his work as inspector of the state farm, then overseeing the state almshouse, and finally with his appointment to the Board of Trustees in 1884. If you're familiar with the Tewksbury Hospital campus and have walked it, so Belcher, this building here, is actually where the parking lot is now for the main hospital. As the almshouse entered the next century and the needs of the patients changed, it was advanced by the new superintendent, Dr. John Nichols, that a name change was necessary to reflect the proper conditions and workings of the institution. By act of the legislature, the name was officially changed from the State Almshouse to the State Hospital on May 23rd, 1900. So we just passed that anniversary. The Board of Trustees and administrative staff believed that the term State Hospital was synonymous with the true character of the institution, as hospital expressed, quote, happily the relation of the state to the three main classes for whom provision is expressly made: the insane, the sick, and the destitute. And just a quick note, we actually have the desk he's sitting at and the chairs we actually have at the Public Health Museum. I love sitting in that chair because I feel like I'm connected with Dr. Nichols there. With Dr. Nichols at the helm, a major building campaign took place in the late 1800s into the early 1900s to refurbish older structures and to erect new buildings to further the mission of the state hospital at Tewksbury. Construction on Asylum 7 began in 1901. It officially opened its doors in 1904 to house the male insane patients. Built for $50,000, the asylum was designed in 3 sections to accommodate various classifications of insanity. Great care was also given in regards to heating and ventilation and to provide for abundant sunlight throughout the building. Asylum 7 would come to be known as the Hecht Asylum after Board of Trustees member Jacob Hecht. It would then later be renamed to the Annie Sullivan Center to honor one of our almshouse's most famous residents. So a presentation about Tewksbury State Hospital would be lacking without the inclusion and nod to one of our most famous patients, Annie Sullivan, the teacher of Helen Keller. To give you a quick background on Annie Sullivan. Annie was born on April 14th, 1866 in Massachusetts to Irish immigrants. At a young age, she developed trachoma, a bacterial infection that affects the eyes, which resulted in visual impairment for the remainder of her life. About 2 years after the death of their mother, Annie and her brother Jimmy were admitted to the state almshouse at Tewksbury. Annie was 10 years old at the time. They resided together in the women's ward until May of 1876, when Jimmy succumbed to tubercular meningitis, or tuberculosis. While at Tewksbury, Annie would receive 2 unsuccessful eye operations before being sent to a hospital in Lowell, Massachusetts, where she underwent another failed eye surgery. After being readmitted to Tewksbury, Anne convinced the state inspector to allow her transfer to the Perkins School for the Blind. She would graduate as valedictorian and obtain a partially successful operation that allowed her to regain some of her vision. Shortly after graduation, Annie would secure a job as teacher for Helen Keller, the famous author and political activist who was both deaf and blind. In addition to the construction of additional buildings for the mental health department patients, the hospital functions of the institution grew enormously under the superintendency of Dr. Nichols, especially as an infectious disease like tuberculosis took center stage. Tuberculosis, or consumption, as it was commonly referred to when you see on the patient records, emerged in the early 20th century as a dominant concern within the field of public health, and many of the cases were sent to Tewksbury. The administration responded by constructing a hospital for consumptives in 1899. This hospital, later named the Bancroft Male Tuberculosis Hospital after Board of Trustees member Cecile Bancroft, was specifically designed and arranged to provide ample fresh air and sunlight to aid in treatment of consumption. Situated in the Pine Grove east of the main buildings across Livingston Street, the hospital site was carefully selected based on its sandy soil, sun, and surroundings, and great care went into the construction to treat consumptives in this ideal condition. Bancroft was originally built to accommodate 100 male patients, classified in 4 different wards based on their severity of their disease. As tuberculosis became more prevalent and fatal in the Commonwealth, Tewksbury administration requested an appropriation for the construction of a female consumptive hospital for the cost of $25,000. This hospital, later named the Fisk House after Board of Trustees Sarah Fisk, was erected in 1906 on the hill to the south of the water reservoir, surrounded by young growth of white pine and oak trees. By the close of its opening day on January 1st, 1908, the Fisk House had already reached its capacity of 40 patients. By 1909, short while after, the Board of Trustees was already requesting the need for expansion of this building. An expansion did take place, not only of the tuberculosis hospitals, but of the whole campus under Nichols's leadership. Dr. John H. Nichols, the enigmatic leader of Tewksbury State Hospital for 38 years, and having spent a total of 44 years serving the institution, was the catalyst for positive change and expansion of the campus to best serve those in need in the Commonwealth. Most of his goals have been accomplished in whole or in part by the time of his retirement. hospitals built for convalescents and tubercular patients, updates to the wooden structures, and first-class fireproofing to standards of the time, housing for nurses, attendants, physicians, and administrators to provide for their safety, health, and happiness, impressive advances in medical research and treatment, and ensuring equity and justice for the best interests of the state, the citizens, and the patients. His remarkable tenure as superintendent positioned the institution for a bright future within the Commonwealth. By the 1860s, funding from the federal government helped support states in providing medical assistance to residents who otherwise could not afford it. Medication to treat infections and mental illness became commonplace, while compulsory vaccinations led to the near eradication of many diseases that patients were treated for at the state infirmary at Tewksbury. With a shift to the Department of Public Health in 1959, operations at Tewksbury Hospital would experience some major changes. No longer were psychiatric patients admitted, along with those infected with smallpox or other contagious diseases dangerous to the public, such as tuberculosis. The services that would continue to be offered included treatment of patients with cardiovascular, pulmonary, renal, neurological, diabetic, and arthritic diseases. The Tewksbury Hospital would also offer surgical operations, have obstetric and pediatric departments, provide specialty clinics for eye, ear, nose, and throat diseases, and maintain an active laboratory. Superintendent Thomas J. Saunders was the one to oversee the institutional changes that would transpire in the second half of the 20th century. The first superintendent to not have a medical background since Thomas J. Marsh in 1883, Saunders received his degree from Holy Cross College in Business Administration. On February 20th, 1951, he began his employment with the Tewksbury State Hospital Infirmary and would lead the institution for 35 years. Before retiring in 1986, Saunders was named the Tewksbury Chamber of Commerce's Man of the Year, among other awards and recognitions for his dedicated service. Among the accomplishments during Saunders' time as superintendent was the construction of a new main hospital building for the campus in the 1960s, with additions being added to expand its occupancy into the 1970s. The new facility would provide modern convenience for patients and staff and would bring many auxiliary functions all under one roof. The new medical building would also be one of the first structures built under the institution's new name. Enacted in 1959 by the Massachusetts legislature, the Tewksbury State Hospital and Infirmary simply became known as the Tewksbury Hospital. And to note, this building was actually named after Thomas Saunders later on as well. Institutional improvements were not all Thomas J. Saunders was known for during his tenure as superintendent. Saunders did much to positively impact the Tewksbury community. With patient numbers shrinking and a majority of hospital services based out of the Saunders building, a 900-acre campus seemed excessive, so he was instrumental in convincing the state to return some land to the town. Around 100 acres were eventually ceded back to Tewksbury and became schools, an elderly housing complex, parks, and a senior center. As the priorities of the Tewksbury Hospital changed, and the majority of operations were housed in the Saunders building, back here, you can see that, the size of that, the dilapidated conditions of the extant buildings necessitated raising. Among those slated for demolition was the long Asylum, the pre-Civil War structure that was one of the oldest of those that would be torn down. By the mid-1970s, when demolition was complete, virtually all of the buildings, unfortunately, relating to the institution's history as an almshouse were gone. Luckily, the structures erected during the major building campaign of the late 1800s and after remained relatively untouched, maintaining some of the historic character of the campus. And when I originally walked to the campus, I thought it was fairly intact before I knew anything about the Tewksbury Hospital, before I started with my involvement with the Public Health Museum. And then you see a map of it in its prime, at its largest, and obviously many of those buildings are gone now, but it still really does maintain a great historic feature to the campus. Amongst the remaining buildings, almost all would find new tenants. The maintenance buildings on the western edge would continue to service the remnants of the once expansive institution. The nurses' home would become an office of mass health. Many of the structures in the southeast part of the campus would house clinical programs, and the old administration building, pictured here, would become the home of the Public Health Museum, the repository of the Tewksbury State Hospital records and artifacts. And we do share this building as well with an office for the Department of Mental Health. So at the center of the town of Tewksbury, Massachusetts, sits an institution brimming with 700 acres of architectural beauty and a rich history of caring for those in need in the Commonwealth. While traveling down East Street, it is nearly impossible to miss the impressive stone entrance, pictured here, looking the same as it did when it was constructed in 1913. There's that entryway now, still there. Just beyond it lies a remarkable space ripe for exploration, interpretation, and memorialization of all those who have entered through its stone walls. So that is our presentation tonight. Thank you so much. That was a quick introduction about the history of the Tewksbury State Hospital, and I hope you enjoyed. There is plenty more to learn, plenty more to experience in the book. Here's a copy. And as Robert mentioned in the beginning, we are having a book signing event on June 5th at the Public Health Museum. That will also include tours. You can sign up for a tour of the museum, the inside of the museum, as well as there are some, if there are tickets left, I don't know, walking tours of the campus. So the Public Health Museum does offer a historical walking tour of the Tewksbury Hospital campus, which will cover some of the things we talked today about, as well as other topics that are in the book. So feel free to join us for that. And if you'd like to purchase a copy of the book, they are available online via Amazon, and the Public Health Museum will also be selling them at the June 5th event, but we'll have them in our gift shop as well. So I hope you enjoyed, and we are definitely available for questions. Robert, if you're ready for question time.
I'm always ready for question time, Ashlyn. So folks, I would encourage you to get your questions into the Q&A box. Sadly, we only have one question in the Q&A box, and that breaks my heart. But I have several questions for you, Ashlyn. First of all, not to get too goofy on you, but just to get it out of the way, because I'm sure there's people on the call that are interested in it. Is the Tewksbury Hospital haunted?
Very good question. I've actually investigated in one of my other many lives. I am a paranormal investigator. I have experienced things. I worked at the Public Health Museum before joining the board, and you know, every once in a while I get some interesting creaks and sounds. I can't say for sure, but it's a good question, and always open to exploring and figuring out if it is haunted.
Okay, now the questions are coming in. Good job, audience. Tracy would like to know, how many people are buried in the cemetery?
Yeah, sure. So we say around 10,000. There is, you know, there's folks that say, oh, there's more than that. But, you know, generally the number we give is 10,000. There are burials that took place before there was kind of written records of the burial plots. So there are, you know, some more that we have in our records, but we do have burial records. So if you have a loved one or family member that may have been buried, or you think or suspect may have been buried at the Tewksbury Hospital Cemetery, you can always reach out to us at the Public Health Museum. I actually complete the genealogy requests, so I can look through our burial database and let you know where a loved one is buried. And actually, a little aside there, one of the projects that we're going to work on from the Public Health Museum is actually putting together a cemetery walking tour to walk you through and point out some of the folks who are buried there and what their lives may have been like, and give you some of their genealogy as well.
Linda would like to know, can you talk a little more about how and why people were admitted to the Olms house?
Sure, absolutely. So initially in the Olms house, it was for state paupers. So that was the idea. So that really meant that immigrants coming into the U.S. And into the area around Tewksbury in the north, where the Tewksbury Asylum or the Tewksbury Almshouse serviced, that folks would, maybe have just recently immigrated. They didn't have a home, they didn't have work, so they could become admitted to the Tewksbury Almshouse, or they can choose to come to the Almshouse and have residents have a roof over their heads, food, water, and then actually gain some work experience to then be able to go out and find a job outside of the almshouse. So especially in the beginning of the institution's history, that was really what it was. But obviously they did, as I mentioned in the presentation, they were seeing folks with various mental health conditions, as well as other infectious diseases that were coming in there as well. Alcoholism was a big problem in the early years. There was a lot of patients who came in with alcoholism as their diagnosis. And really, yes, Judith, I posted in there, care was basic. Absolutely. Like, there was not a lot of care in the beginning. So Almshouse was really like providing a roof over their heads and job opportunity, and basically, have them suffice. And later on, you get more medical care and various other opportunities for the hospital department, mental health, etc.
So a couple of requests that you talk about the tunnels, and that's in capital letters from Judith. Tim wants to know, do the tunnels still exist beneath where the old buildings were?
Some, not all. Some do. Some have obviously collapsed over the years. Some of them have been filled in. As I mentioned, obviously a lot of the old almshouse or the really early buildings, especially the male hospital wards, the female hospital wards on either side, kind of flanking the old administration building, those are all gone now. And those did have tunnels under most of them. I know some folks on this call tonight worked there and may have been through some of those tunnels. So some of them are gone, some of them are still there. I've only seen maybe like one or two. I don't know if any of them are still in operation. Maybe some of our Tewksbury Hospital folks could say if they are still in operation, if any of them are. Judith said they were lit by a single light bulb. That is quite scary. But yes, there definitely was some, and there still are some.
Mary asks, is it true that the Tewksbury Hospital housed Confederate prisoners of war during the Civil War?
Very interesting question. I have never heard that, and I have never necessarily found evidence of that. I would be happy to look into that, and I can reach back out to you if I find evidence of that. But to my knowledge, no, but definitely can get back to you on that question.
If you want to give us your contact information, one of us can reach out to you afterwards. Research into that. That's I haven't heard that one either, but I know some in Cushing was one of them. Some of the hospitals did take prisoners after World War II, so it makes sense. But
I'm definitely happy to look into it though. Yeah.
And actually, what I can do is, Ashlyn and John, I can provide your contact information in the email I send out tomorrow, and then perhaps folks will follow up with emails for you both. Yeah. And by the way, John, I'm not letting you off the hook. I have a couple of questions for you before we wrap up.
Oh, I like to. Anyone who knows me knows I like to talk about stuff.
Okay. Couple of questions on Annie Sullivan. We can try to do these in a bunch here. Is Annie Sullivan's brother buried in the cemetery? Roberta would like to know.
He is. Absolutely. So yes, he is. So we will cover him in our eventual cemetery walking tour. Yes.
Jill says, besides Anne Sullivan, were there any other famous patients?
Question. We are in the process. So some of our records are digitized. The original intake records from 1854 up to 1884. That was a project done with UMass Lowell about 10 years ago now. And we actually just received a digital capacity grant for the Public Health Museum to digitize the records, the intake records going forward from 1884. So hopefully those will be made available in the next year or so. And that's something that we'd love to delve into, is get an understanding of who the patients were, and hopefully identify some other famous patients, although each person obviously is important that was there and has their own stories to tell. And so I love to uncover some of those stories, of infamous folks that were at Tewksbury as well.
Tracy asks, what kind of mental health treatments did the hospital do? For example, electric shock, insulin treatment, and an anonymous attendee asks, did lobotomies take place at the hospital?
No lobotomies were taking place at the hospital, to my knowledge. There's never any note of that in any of the asylum medical records that I've ever seen.
Some hospitals are much more common than others. Like Dan
Right.
mentioned with a lot of them, but not all of the hospitals are the same.
And if for whatever reason, like there was a recommendation to have a patient have a lobotomy performed on them, I mean, like likely they would have sent them to Danvers or something, another institution that would perform those. But as I mentioned, initially, and not every case, later on, the more violent, insane, as they were called then, there were wards for those patients as well. But the majority were harmless, insane, as they called it. So folks who were it was more chronic like care. So folks who were there, who were older, that may have kind of lived their lives at Tewksbury that couldn't, that were institutionalized. So, mostly there was not a ton of mental health treatment going on. There was hydrotherapy tubs at Tewksbury in, I believe, one of the violent wards. And that's one of the main treatments I've seen noted for mental health patients at Tewksbury. I'm sure likely they were probably doing insulin coma therapy. They may have been doing electroshock in some way, but really it's not noted much at all in the records and the medical records that were there. Like a general overview of medical records from that time didn't mention anything like that. So I suspect hydrotherapy was their main form of treatment for mental health patients.
Patricia and William ask, weren't pregnant unmarried women sent there? And an anonymous attendee asks, how many women were housed in the asylum? I believe the building is now abandoned.
Yeah, so to the first question, yes, there was a maternity hospital. That's something that's covered in the book, but I didn't get into it here tonight. But there was a maternity hospital, so unmarried women, or women that were in the almshouse who may have became pregnant, were treated and cared for in the maternity hospital. And they did take care of women, maternity patients, and then the children subsequently may have stayed at the almshouse if their parents or their mother was an almshouse patient. So they did actually have a children's hospital as well, which is covered in the book. So you can learn more about that as well.
Okay.
Oh, there was a second part to that question. I'm sorry, Robert.
Sorry, I'm trying to save time and ask two questions at once. So how many women were housed in the asylum? I believe the building is now abandoned.
So you're talking about the Rice building. So the Rice building is still standing and abandoned. So that housed, I believe it was intended for about 100 women initially. And that building, actually you can go inside of it on our photography tours that we do with two of our photography friends for the Public Health Museum. So if you are interested in actually seeing inside of some of the buildings, you'll actually be able to do that on those tours. And we're hoping to pick one up either late summer or in the fall.
Some of the almshouses had their own jails or cells. Did Tewksbury have one?
I've not seen any notation of a jail per se. There's not much information about the original almshouse building and what kind of the layout was of that structure. I know there was a chapel, obviously, rooms for the patients. There was a kitchen. The original kitchen was in the basement of the initial almshouse building, the wooden building. I haven't found any notation of a jail. Obviously cells, with some of the mental health buildings. So the Rice building, for example, those actually had separate rooms for patients to stay in, although especially when there was some overcrowding, patients may have also kind of been in the main areas of each floor of the Rice building, but there were individual rooms as well which could be used. They could close them if they were having a violent episode.
Excellent. An update from Sandra from the Public Health Museum wanted to note that the walking tours are full for June 5th, but they do offer monthly Saturday walking tours. So thanks for the update, Sandra. Speaking of jails and cells, Teresa wants to know, did any of the patients ever attempt to escape? Oh, yeah, John?
Yeah, because I know the walking tour is full, but I mean, you still come and get the books, get a book and everything.
Yes, absolutely.
The book signing's still happening.
I'm sorry if I misspoke. Yeah, so Saturday, June 5th, 10 to 2, get your book autographed, Ashlyn and John at the Public Health Museum. Okay, so Teresa wants to know, and I actually know the answer to this. I have a fun story, but Teresa wants to know, did any of the patients ever attempt to escape?
Yes, of course. It happens. Robert, you have do you have a good story to share?
Yeah,
yes, obviously they did.
Well, it's not a story so much as an anecdote, but I do know, and I'll try to find the information. But I know that somebody with leprosy actually escaped from the Olms house, and I'll try to provide more information about that episode in the chat. But yes, that has happened for sure in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the annual reports, it notes kind of how many runaways they had. It definitely happens, as any state institution. It happens. Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's see. Anne wants to know, when did the hospital close the emergency room and stop being a hospital open to the public for procedures?
Good question. I don't know the exact year. It wasn't that long ago. Maybe one of the hospital staff that are on tonight can answer that, like the exact year. It was in fairly recent history, I would say, because I believe I remember almost seeing emergency room sign at some point. So I don't know the exact answer to that question. I don't know the exact year, but yeah, maybe someone in the chat can answer that.
John wants to know, when was the last baby born there?
Oh, I'm sure up till recently, I would say, depending.
Trick question, Ashlyn.
Trick question, absolutely. I'm sure up till fairly recently as well. Obviously, the campus, the hospital is still active, and there are a lot of other programs on the campus, and very well could have been quite recently, at least in our lifetimes, I'm sure. Yeah.
Let's circle back to the cemetery. Sigut asks, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing names, I do that all the time. Where is the cemetery? Is there another cemetery not on the grounds? My friend's mother was buried not on the direct grounds.
Sure. So the Pine Cemetery, which is the large cemetery, is basically just across Livingston Street, very near where the Bancroft Tuberculosis Hospital was. So that is basically in a big pine bank. So if you're coming down East Street from the east, you will, from the east going towards the campus, on the left side, you'll see the cemetery. And there is a big sign in the front that shows you Tewksbury State Hospital Cemetery. And we've done a lot of work, there's folks in the community, Tom, that has done amazing work with restoring the cemetery and trying to move that along and make it a really solemn and respectable place for folks to visit.
Yeah, thumbs up. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Ashley.
Oh, no, it's okay. And then there is a second cemetery, which is basically by the Saunders Recreation Area. So I'm not remembering the name of that school over there, but it's kind of in the back. So those are more recent patient burials there, and as well as I think some other like retained organs and such have been buried there as well. If I remember correctly, that was some much more recent use. So yes, there are two.
That's better for that. If you go to the where the school is, it's down there. The path. If you're coming in, you go to the right, and kind of stay to the back. You'll find the cemetery down there on the path.
Gotcha.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's easier to do that than to come from the hospital itself.
Absolutely. You get lost in the woods on the way.
Yes.
And then speaking of the cemetery there, well, so first of all, thumbs up to Tom Marshall and his group of volunteers. and I don't know if you're the right person to ask, Ashlyn, but you seem to know everything about the hospital. Do you know if any funding, this is from Joanne, do you know if any funding has happened this year to continue the cleanup of Little Pines?
There has not been any funding this year. We did secure some funding in the past few years to do some work to preserve the cemetery. So happy about that. But hopefully in the future we can continue that. And Tom, I believe Tom is planning to maybe have a cleanup sometime later this year. There is a Save the Tewksbury Pines Cemetery Facebook group that you can join if you're interested in learning more about the cemetery and the work to restore that space. So feel free to join that group, and you can keep up to date on the potential for our next cleanup event.
And Cheryl and Paige just wanted to note that the other cemetery is between the Wynn Middle School and the Rec Center. So thank you for that clarification.
Thank you.
Let's see. Oh, okay. Thank you, Joanne, for your volunteer service. Tim notes that there was a bowling alley on the hospital campus at one point. That is a fun fact.
There is a bowling alley. So that is something else you'll see on the tour if you do the photo workshop. The bowling alley is in the basement of the chapel. So.
All right, let's get a little creepy here. There was a rumor that people down on their luck would sell their bodies to the Harvard Medical School for dissection after they had passed. Is there any documentation of that?
So the hospital, of course, they did have, sell bodies for anatomical research. That was definitely within the legal rights of the institution as state paupers. So basically, the state would have so many days, and that number of days changed over the years. But by law, they had so many days to basically a family would be able to come and claim their loved one's body. And so then if it was never claimed, they could either bury them in the cemetery, or they were allowed to bring the body to a medical school for anatomical research. If you want to learn more about the changing laws over time, I wrote an article a few years ago in the Public Health Museum newsletter about that specifically. So you can actually find our newsletters on the website www.publichealthmuseum.com and go to our newsletters tab, and you can actually read that article, and that goes into depth of the changing number of days. One time it was 14 days you had, other times it was like 48 hours, and how long a family had to claim bodies. But yes, it was actually within the right of the state to do that according to law. So yes, that is true. There were bodies that were sold to medical institutions, but it was not illegal at the time.
I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
I think he was asking if the patients, did he ask if the patients themselves were getting the money?
The patients themselves.
Was that the question? Whether not so much with the hospital obviously did it, right? Wasn't the question about whether these people had
other
money?
People were?
Yeah.
So I
right.
I guess that's definitely some legend and lore. I don't know if I think that kind of goes to the idea of like the grave robbing, which was brought up by Governor Butler. I think what his allegations were that was the hospital, at that time the Olms house staff were digging up bodies in the middle of the night and bringing them, which they didn't necessarily need to do that. That was more work for them because they could have just, by law, they could have donated those bodies in the first place. But I mean, potentially early history, there may have been folks in the community may have been doing that. I definitely have heard that kind of story in other institutions across really the country. Actual evidence of that, it's hard to find actual evidence of someone, a random person in town digging up a body and selling it. But I'm sure those instances happened. So. Yeah.
All right, we're in overtime here. We'll go 5 more minutes. Let's consider this a lightning round, Ashlyn, okay? Pat wants to know, do we have any idea how many residents of Tewksbury worked at the hospital at its peak?
Good question. I feel like I knew this number at some point, but I don't remember on the top of my head. Definitely in the several hundreds. And I believe someone else had a question about the nursing school slash, patient or staff living on campus. Staff did live on campus. There were multiple nurses' homes for the female nurses as well as male nurses in attendance. Lots of staff lived on campus. Lots of buildings popped up over time to accommodate the growing staff. I would say there was at least probably several hundred staff, 250 plus, that were, working for the institution at one time. It probably was even more than that in the peak years. So I don't have an exact number, but definitely enough to substantiate about 8 or so staff buildings on campus.
And that's great. Your answer actually answered a couple of other questions.
Good. There we go.
Do that more often. Okay. So an anonymous attendee asks, were the old houses on Livingston Street? Who were the old houses on Livingston Street used for? I always heard that they were for the doctors. Did we lose you, Ashlyn? We were doing so well.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know the answer to that question yet. I know there were doctors' departments.
Oh, you're back, Ashlyn. My joke was so good that you were laughing for 30 seconds.
Oh no!
Did you hear what I said, Ashlyn?
I think so. Yeah, the houses on Livingston.
That's right.
Yes. So yes, some staff lived there, as well as I believe one of the head farmers may have also had one of the houses. But yeah, and staff could live there. Administrators of the institution. A wide array of folks lived in those houses. Not all of them were related to the Olms house, I suspect. But yes, there definitely were some.
Lori wants to know what records are available at the Public Health Museum to better understand treatments for and impacts of infectious diseases.
I love that question. Yes, so we have a plethora of records and exhibits related to infectious diseases, and then also how Tewksbury Hospital played a role as a public health institution in Massachusetts in the history of public health in general. So yes, if you come and visit the Public Health Museum, you can see all kinds of exhibits related to infectious diseases, to mental health care, nursing. So you can learn a lot more about nursing. I didn't get to cover that because that is a huge topic. It could be a presentation in itself about the nursing program at Tewksbury, but there are many, many pages about it in the book. So definitely can learn more there. And we do have the records for the Tewksbury Hospital, many of the historical records, as well as obviously the photographs which were used in the book. So quick shout out, thank you so much to the Public Health Museum for allowing us to use those books, as well as all the other folks who allowed us to utilize their photos in their collection for the publishing of the book. So yes, so if you come to the Public Health Museum, you can learn lots more, and we have a whole kind of resource library related to different topics that is all thematic in our mailroom.
And for the record, the Tewksbury Public Library made the book. We provided one of the maps that John and Ashlyn included. So
you absolutely did.
We got a credit. We're very excited. Robin wants to know. She asked this a couple of times. Robin wants to know: are there pictures or records of the nurses, especially from the 1800s? She's interested.
Absolutely, Robin. So many. Yes, if you were interested, as an aside to this, obviously there's a lot of information about the nursing program in this book. We at the Public Health Museum have a nursing class photo for almost every nursing class that the training school graduated from the 1890s all the way to 42 last class, as well as some of the photos for the
Ashlyn, I think you might have froze again.
Oh,
now you're back. I think this is just Zoom's way of telling us to wrap up. I have 2 more questions for you, Ashlyn, okay? Because basically this question has been asked 4 different ways by 4 different people. Thomas wants to know what activities go on today at the hospital, and Maria wants to know what kind of medical service does the hospital provide now?
Sure. So the hospital itself provides all kinds of clinical and specialty services in the Thomas J. Saunders building. And then the campus in general really has so many different, obviously the Public Health Museum and the Old Administration Building, but there are several other nonprofits that are on the So there's the GROW program, there is Power for Flowers, and there are, I believe, and then the Strongwater Farm. So there are several non as well as so lots of things. There's only a few unused buildings at the moment, but I'm sure they will also probably find some tenants in the future. And yeah, so it's a very active campus. So that hopefully covers those questions. What is with the campus like now and the medical services?
I'll wrap up. We might cover one or two quickly, but I want to wrap up with this one. Pat wants to know what movies or TV shows have been filmed on the hospital grounds.
So big TV show recently was Castle Rock. So Hulu's Castle Rock was filmed in the superintendent's home, as well as in the old administration building. I believe some of the tunnels. So the few tunnels that are left for the earlier question, I believe they filmed one of the scenes in a tunnel. And I'm not sure, I think they did some maybe in the Rice building. I think those are the main buildings that they filmed in. So that we've had a few movies that have been filmed. Nothing's jumping out at me at the moment for what those movies are off the top of my head, but we did have one of our claims to fame, although I have never found it in the movie, so it's very sad. I want to be able to find it in the movie. Maybe it's in a deleted scene. One of our cabinets in our mailroom at the Public Health Museum was supposedly in Shutter Island. That's another. So if someone has the deleted scenes and we can find it, I will be very happy.
I think one of Adam Sandler's Netflix films, Hubie Halloween.
Hubie Halloween. That is in the Rice building. That's the Rice building. So if you go on a photography tour, you will be able to very, very easily line up that first intro and know exactly where in the Rice building that was filmed.
Paige in pink also notes Manchester by the Sea. Thank you, Paige.
Thank you, Paige.
That had a couple of scenes. What a great depressing film that was. And so let's plug a few things here and answer questions at the same time. Patty wants to know, how do you sign up for the photo workshop that you referenced?
Yeah, so that is something we are working on with the our photo guys who run that workshop. So hopefully we'll send out an announcement about that, as well as their photography groups. We'll send out a sign up, an announcement for that. Like I said, hopefully late summer, fall, we'll have our first one back. And we'll definitely share that on the Public Health Museum social media page, or if you would like to sign up for our newsletter, I believe there's a sign up on the website. You can get information and updates about what we're doing, and that would be included with our announcements as well.
And then John has a question about your tours, the Public Health Museum's tours, so maybe plug that. He wants to know if they're handicap accessible.
The outdoor tours, absolutely. The indoor tours as well, absolutely. Yeah. So there are some areas that, the outdoor tour, the outdoor tour is fully handicap accessible as well. So yes, both of them are.
And Leslie has a question about the Community Cookbook, which I'll quickly plug. My understanding, Leslie, and I know there's people on the line that know the answer to this and will probably be upset if I give you the wrong answer, but I believe the Friends of the Library are going to sell their cookbook online. You'll be able to order it and they'll mail it to you. You might be charged a few extra bucks for the postage. But the book does not go on sale for a couple more weeks, okay, is my understanding. So I'll follow up with you though, Leslie, and I'll provide more information. All right, so enough about that. So John, Ashlyn, any last words before we wrap up here?
I don't think so. Thank you so much for having us, Robert. We really enjoyed talking about the history. I know it's definitely a passion for us to learn more about the history and share it with the public. And it's such a fascinating institution and, continuously operational one for all of these years. So looking forward to continually telling the story, especially as we get, as we move along with the history and the institution stays operational. I did want to just make a quick note that if anyone, especially staff or folks who had some kind of experience with Tewksbury, if you wanted to reach out to me, I would love to do some oral history interviews with folks. Our goal is to create our website to have all of the photos digitized, available for you all to view. So this only has so many photos in it. There are really probably about 200 more photos that couldn't fit into the book. So we are going to make a website where you can actually see all of the images in our collection at the Public Health Museum, as well as some of these other institutions that we had permission to use photos from. And then I would love to do some oral history interviews with folks and make those available with permission to the public. So always happy to learn more.
Especially any employees or like patients, it always gives different insights. A lot of times that stuff doesn't get, recorded. The patient's daily life, make it record what they eat or something, but not their experiences, which you'll also find if you find old postcards, if you have letters, anything like that. You get insights you don't otherwise get.
Absolutely. Yeah, would love to hear any stories of the hospital. So yeah, thank you so much. Hopefully we'll see some of you on June 5th so we can pick up a copy, and happy to answer, John or I will be happy to answer more questions via email afterwards as well. So thank you. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you, Ashlyn. Thank you, John. Best of luck with the book. The entire town of Tewksbury is very excited about your book, and really I'm personally looking forward to reading it. And I wish you luck with your book signing on Saturday, June 5th from 10 to 2 at the Public Health Museum. So thank you, Ashlyn. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Great turnout. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.